Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good.
So I'm handing it over to Commissioner Fish.
Thank you, Madam President. And I understand the mayor's delayed, so we're going to get started this morning. So thank you, President Udaley and colleagues. And I want to also begin today by thanking Commissioner Udaley and her staff for all the work that they have been doing with us and others on boards and commissions, and thank you in particular for co-sponsoring this effort. And I want to also thank our superstar lawyer, Judy Prosper, who has carried the biggest load and in many respects has been the inspiration for the work that we're going to be talking about today. Good citizens are the riches of a city. C.E.S. Wood said this over 125 years ago, and it's been true ever since. At the City of Portland, we rely on community members to help us make good decisions. But too often, we set them up for failure. And for too long, we've been unclear about our expectations. Today, we're going to lay out a comprehensive set of reforms to improve and modernize our established boards and commissions. One particular issue has received significant attention, thanks in part to reporting by the Northwest Examiner. That's our conflict of interest requirements. We have a form, it turns out, but we don't require anyone to fill it out, and that must change. This morning, Judy Prosper will walk us through the draft proposal, and we'll have a chance to discuss it and get feedback from the council. Our plan is to come back to council on May 3rd with a resolution setting forth the roadmap for future work. Ultimately, we hope to have an ordinance ready by Labor Day for your consideration. And with that, I want to introduce Judy. And again, Judy, thanks for all your good work.
Thank you, Commissioner. Good morning, Commissioners. I haven't been before this body in a while, so it's my pleasure to be here this morning as usual. As the Commissioner stated, I guess to start with the sort of issue we're trying to address and correct are some, I would say problems with current boards and commissions, and not so much with the great and wonderful suggestions that we get from our citizens to staff members, to council, but really about the administration of boards and commissions, how they come to be, why they come to be, their form, their formats, and what, in chatting with Commissioners Fish and Udaley, we've thought through are some better ways or suggestions to make them more efficient and effective in involving the public in decisions made by the government. So with that, I think that there's 8 points that are on the handout that I will briefly go through, and then we can have a discussion. The first thing is there's no centralized database, believe it or not, for all the boards and commissions we have in the City of Portland. We have, the City Attorney's Office has sort of served ad hoc as an advisor when asked and troubleshooted issues that come up, ethics issues, public meetings and public records issues, but only when asked. There's not a system to train all new boards and commissions or all new board members. So the first thing is keeping track and finding out how many boards and commissions we do have. The last count we did, which was informal, was about 150 between the ones that are in code or charter and ones that sort of have their origin inside of a bureau and are advisory boards for a particular project, or the West Quadrant Plan, for example. I guess there are 5 quadrants, even though there should be 4, but there are 5 plans that made up the comprehensive plan. And so we sort of started troubleshooting, and then we got together, the City Attorney's Office with the commissioners, to see how we could form a comprehensive program. So a centralized database is the first tenet.
And has there been any discussion of where and who would be responsible for that?
I think that I'll leave that to the commissioners a little bit later. But if it's okay, should I go through the 8 points?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
And that's one of the open questions about where this would be located, who would be responsible, things like that. So that's one of the things we'll be discussing later this morning.
So city staff training. For every board or commission, there is a city staff member who liaises with that board or commission, and we feel that they should be trained on some basics from the beginning to how and why the board was, good morning, Mayor. How and why the board was created, public meetings, public records, and the like. Also, Robert's Rules trainings, or if it's a less formal board, some other kind of facilitation skill. Application process. There is an application on the ONI website, that's Office of Neighborhood Involvement website, that serves as a template, but each board or commission usually makes up their own application. So perhaps making that a little bit more uniform will be sure to hit some of the issues or conflicts ahead of time. Selection process. The city has public involvement principles that were set out by council several years ago, and the selection processes for each of the boards and commissions happens sort of from the origin each time. There's not a pattern or a template for how members of boards should be selected. Each board sort of usually thinks through what kinds of constituencies they need to hear from, and then they create a selection process. Again, making that more uniform might enable the city to reach out to the far corners of the communities to get more people on board, which is something that the Office of Neighborhood Involvement is currently doing. What they're doing is they're sort of going out into the communities and training up folks to apply for a seat on various boards and commissions. But again, there's no centralized process for doing so. Bylaw templates. Again, bylaws are written by the first seating of most boards and commissions. They are not uniform. They have different reasons for removal. They have different quorum requirements. They have different disparate policies for every board and commission. And some boards and commissions revisit their bylaws regularly to try to adapt to some changes, but most bylaws are written by the first seating of any board, and our proposal will be to create a sort of uniform bylaw template that boards and commissions could really plug into. And again, to be sure that and I'll talk about that in a little bit, that the two areas that are that are not in compliance with the law at times are the public meetings and public records law, governed by the Yellow Book, that's put out by the Attorney General on public meetings and public records. And the second place is for ethics. 240 ORS 244 governs public officials' behavior when they sit in their capacity. Council members are public officials, that's obvious. I'm a public official, that's obvious. But volunteers on boards are also public officials when they sit in their capacity as board members. And there are various obligations that they hold that I am afraid that they're not always aware of until an issue arises. So we would like to propose a robust training before people are seated on boards and commissions for all members, a way of tracking whether board members have received the training, and again, FAQs and the like to troubleshoot. Member conduct. That goes back to both Oregon State Law 244, ORS 244, and City Code 1.03, which speaks of sort of the expectations. The City Code is really aspirational. It speaks to expectations of public officials because the state law obviously is supreme over that. And there's some added expectations that the city has above and beyond the state. Lastly, surveys at the end of service. We don't have a way of finding out whether our citizens had a good experience while they served on our boards. Did they enjoy it? Did they feel like they were contributing positively? There's no, again, back to the first point, central database, there's no way of looking back and seeing how folks work together on a certain board, whether the numbers of people on the board were enough or too much. And we suggest surveys at the end of everyone's service so that we can keep better track and learn from some of the mistakes or issues that arose at various boards. So I'm going to just leave it there and open it up for questions.
Mayor, since the mayor has joined us, the run of show today is Judy Prosper has walked us through the 8 principles, and there are sub-bullets in each of these principles of issues for our discussion. Our goal is to get some council feedback today, to then, over the next 4 weeks, craft a resolution to come back to council, which would essentially direct bureaus to do things. Pull together lists of all your boards and commissions, compile lists of all your bylaws that are used in those, answer some basic questions so that we have a comprehensive understanding about how all of our bureaus manage boards and commissions. And then once we've digested all that information and had follow-up conversations with council members, come back sometime around Labor Day with an ordinance that says, here's our vision of how we want to reform and modernize our entire system. And so that gives us, we're at the very beginning part of this process doing sort of issue spotting. The resolution will then direct people to pull together information, and sometime around Labor Day we hope to have a consensus document we can come to council that says this is our new vision, and it will answer questions like where is this going to be located, how will it be funded, what are the expectations, things of that nature. Very good. Thank you.
I'd just like to thank Commissioner Fish for engaging my office on this topic. It's something that's very important to me, and thank you, Judy, for all your valuable input. As someone who's served on a variety of boards and committees, I know what it's like to feel that my time and energy has not been put to its best use, and I want to ensure that we're doing that at the city level by honoring community members' time and contributions. And I'm also concerned with ensuring more diverse representation, and we'll get into that when we talk about term limits and how we fill those seats and make sure that we have truer representation across our boards and committees. Making the most of our community members as partners in policy making. I mean, I consider community input to be absolutely vital. I can't possibly know the unique needs and concerns of every demographic in the city or neighborhood. So I want to make sure that we're getting the best we can out of them, and also addressing community concerns, because there certainly is a lot of criticism and perhaps cynicism around transparency and accountability and ethics, and feeling like these committees are sometimes stacked with people with special interests, or other people are being crowded out. So those are my
Commissioner, can I
thoughts.
follow up on one of your points? You've raised a question that I want to ask Judy to address about whether Robert's rules must apply to every single body that we create. And I know Commissioner Udaley feels very strongly that particularly for more informal boards, there ought to be a more flexible approach to how decision-making is done and how the meetings are conducted, particularly where that particular board is set up not so much to give us a vote that comes to council, but rather to give us a range of perspectives that then help inform our decision-making. Judy, could you talk about Robert's rules, when it does apply, when it doesn't, and how much flexibility the council would have to craft other rules depending on the body?
Absolutely. So the council has pretty much absolute authority on building these boards and commissions. There's so many of them, and I think there's a sort of a reaction to say, when we have a topic that we need discussion, we must put together a board and commission, and we must designate individual people to serve on those boards. Once we begin to make the board so formal, we start to get on the road to having to comply with public meetings laws, creating public officials, et cetera. So it's really all has to be thought through at the inception. Exactly what you mentioned, Commissioner Fish. What do we need from this board and commission? Do we need for them to give us a rate that we're going to charge our citizens for utilities? Is that what we need from them? So we need them to really be in tuned and knowledgeable about, sewers and electricity and the like? Do we need a number that comes with a lot of knowledge to be brought to council and voted on? Or do we really need just ideas? And if we're talking about ideas, we can deformalize, I think I just made up a word, some of these boards and commissions and make them more accessible. And by deformalizing them, we get them on the off-ramp, as I'll call it, to this chart that I'm looking for in the Yellow Book that says when a committee or commission is subject to public meetings laws. I've heard a lot from lots of board members that say, why can't we call each other or email or send text messages or meet for coffee somewhere? But then we get the whenever three or more of us, or the whenever the quorum is met, we can't have those meetings. They violate public meetings rules. They violate the public meetings checklist. You can never have an email exchange that complies with public meetings laws because you need to give notice. You can never have an informal, let's get together for coffee to discuss this at a Starbucks because you're going to violate public meetings law. So it's about thinking through what the council wants from each of these bodies, what a bureau might need from a body. I'll give an example, sort of two examples. One is I was working with the Housing Bureau on the Northeast Portland preference policy. So what they decided to do in the Bureau is not create a sort of board or commission, but they invited stakeholders from various organizations. So if they needed a stakeholder from council, one day Commissioner Fritz could go, another day Commissioner Udaley could go, and so on. But if you mandated that it had to be the mayor, then only the mayor could come and participate. So really kind of, is it the representation you want of a certain group or stakeholder, or is it a person that you want? Because the public meetings rule doesn't allow for proxies. So the person who's nominated has to be the person who shows up, creates the quorum, and votes.
So if I can, because I've been getting an education in this area in our meetings, let me just see if I can put it in my words. Historically, when the council has wanted to get community input, we just declare that we're going to establish an oversight body of some kind, a board, a commission, or whatever. And typically, we haven't spent a lot of time thinking through what it is or what the alternatives are. And one of the things I've learned from this process is the value of the council spending more time at the front end asking some basic questions. What is the goal here? What do we want? Do we want something formal like the Planning and Sustainability Commission, or do we want something as informal as possible where anyone can show up at a meeting, offer a perspective, and what we get is comments back? And then once we've decided what we want, then we have to get legal advice as to how to structure it, and then we want to make sure that our other values kick in terms of broad representation, training, clear guidelines, someone who's available to answer questions and the like. And I think that's been sort of the missing piece, at least during my service. We have the instinct about wanting to get community participation, but we probably haven't spent enough time asking what it is we want, and then being clear to the people we ask to participate, what are the rules that govern. And one of the things, Mayor, I'm going to suggest, and I'd ask you to put it in your proposed budget, that we spring for 5 copies of the Yellow Book, because one of the things I would like to do is have ask Judy to sit down with each office and do like a 101 on the Yellow Book, because there's a lot of stuff in there that I think we need a refresher course on, including.
I'll call Powell's this afternoon
Thank
to
you.
get a used copy.
And
for
there's
us.
including cheat sheets in the Yellow Book where they take a lot of the drama out of it. It tells you, for example, based on the number of committee members, what constitutes a quorum. So you don't have to make that up. But I think I would benefit from a refresher course on some of those things, and I think we should offer that to the council.
Absolutely, and we actually have a guide for volunteer boards and commissions that was created to fill the need of getting all the different city attorneys who are advising different bureaus, getting questions about, well, what happens when this happens or that happens? So we created the city attorney's office, this approximately 50-page slideshow that we offer. But again, since we're the city attorney's office and we can't force anyone to do anything, it only comes at the request of a bureau. So when a bureau says, I'm about to, or I'm thinking of, or I'm having some issues with this board, that's when we come in and we give the training. And then a lot of times, we unfortunately discover that there are some abnormalities in how things have been going.
So let me back what Commissioner Fish said, because my experience with boards and commissions is that there's oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes a lack of clarity about what the expectations of that group are. So I like where Commissioners Fish and Udaley are going with being very clear about the proposed definitions of different groups, because that gets to both the expectations and the second issue, which is span of control. I have found that committees, work groups, task forces, commissions are very much unclear about what their actual span of control is, where their authority lies, and what their purpose is, whether it's policy making, whether it's advisory, whether it's simply collecting information and disseminating information. And it gets to what Commissioner Fish said about spending a little bit of time on the front end and really hashing out what we need, because that helps define what the role and the span of control are going to be. Are we going to spend a little bit more time on this selection process and input? Because that's an area I'm very interested in. I know Commissioner Udaley just put that in a parking lot. And
Definitely.
I'd very much like to get to that too.
I just want to address what you were talking about in span of control. Really, almost every board in the city, beside the one gathered here, is an advisory board. You are the decision makers, you are the lawmakers, and so everyone else in the city is advisory, or 98% of everyone else is advisory. And I think we need to talk about what the definition of advisory means. It means gathering input and passing it up to the decision makers so that they get, as Commissioner Udaley said, they get sort of a broader perspective on what it is people want or need. So I think putting that out there right up front, because oftentimes I've found with boards and commissions, people are frustrated, but we voted unanimously for this to occur and council didn't do it. So it's really understanding sort of the limitations and maybe some frustrations about the limited role that boards and commissions have. They're not lawmakers, they're not policy creators, they're policy suggestors.
Well, one other area, and I'll go back and second what Commissioner Udaley said about having served on boards and commissions and felt that time and energy perhaps could have been spent elsewhere, perhaps taking up knitting or some other activity, and I've certainly had those experiences myself. There's often a lack of clarity around expectations for feedback from the deciders, whoever that is, whether it's a bureau director, whether it's a city council, whether it's somebody else. And I served on one commission at the state level, and I basically quit after a year because I realized we were just shouting into outer space. Nobody was really on the receiving end of any of our recommendations or ideas, and we were getting exactly zero feedback in terms of the work that we were offering. And so I feel like part of the responsibility for us is if we create a board or a commission or an advisory group or one of these other proposed definitions of city bodies, we have to be really clear about what level of feedback or how we're going to close the loop with that group, so they don't take a unanimous vote and then say, what the heck just happened? They did something completely different. Because then that just creates a lot of ill will.
I agree that that's been one of the major frustrations of board members. And when you have 150 boards and commissions floating around there, it's a lot of legwork to get the feedback loop closed.
So I really appreciate Commissioner Fish and Commissioner Daly bringing this forward, and that we now have a chance to discuss it. I know Commissioner Fish has been working on it for over a year, so I'm glad that we now have something on the table to discuss. Obviously, the question of where all of this tracking and administration would be located is a huge one. Back in 2011, when we were looking at setting up a Charter Review Commission, I had the Office of Neighbourhood Involvement inventory all of the boards and commissions we knew of, got with demographics as to who was serving on them in order for it to help us select members for that Charter Commission. And it was a big effort just to do it once, and this is probably a full-time staff person's job on this. I want to add to number 2 on staff training. It says bodies mandated by city charter or code. There are some bodies that are mandated by state law, whether or not they're in our code. For instance, the Planning and Sustainability Commission has to recommend on street vacations. So we need to make sure we're looking at that. I certainly want to state up front my value that these groups should be public officials and should be public unless otherwise indicated. I think that's what the public expects in Portland, and I don't think we should be having email discussions behind scenes or meetings in coffee shops that decide things that then we are a slang dump when they come to the public meeting. That's just not consistent with how I believe we should be doing our work. I'm a little troubled by some of the uniformity requirements. Commissioner Fish, you mentioned the quorum, and we just had a very in-depth discussion of the quorum for the Citizens Review Committee and whether it, a subcommittee and how much is a quorum there, because they wanted more members to be available to serve, but not necessarily more members showing up at every meeting. So that's...
Can I engage you on that for a second? Because what we learned recently from council is that state law has some quorum requirements. And one of the things that I hope we can drill down on is what are the legal requirements around a quorum? When let's say you have a 15-person body, what's the legal requirement? And then, assuming there isn't a quorum, what alternatives does that body have to do any kind of decision-making? So, for example, I think we benefit most when someone comes before us and says, we had a robust discussion, here's what some people thought, here's what some other people thought. I'm personally less interested in finding out that it was a 5-4 vote, bitterly divided or something. What I think the magic is hearing a synopsis of what people on both sides, and what I've noticed, particularly in our land use work, is that sometimes a robust minority view carries the day at council. So I want to make sure, even if a group doesn't have a quorum, so therefore can't do something formal, I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to hear informal feedback, because ultimately the goal is to hear those voices. And an informal meeting that doesn't meet a quorum requirement almost is like a focus group. And when someone comes forward and says, some people thought this, some people thought that, that's helpful to our decision making, because then it allows us to ask questions of staff that maybe we hadn't thought of based on public input.
And that's one instance, and obviously community members can come at the public hearing. In other instances, on a commission that I served on, the decision as to who was going to be the chair and vice chair was absolutely decided outside of public meetings, probably at coffee shops. And it took me like 7 years to realize what was happening, that somehow I was thinking I hadn't got the memo, and indeed I had not got the memo, that others had decided who was going to be the chair and vice chair. So I think, that is of concern to me. I do agree with the mayor on the upfront statements of both the expectations for what is this board and commission, what's their authority, or they're not really, as you said, they're advisory, but also what are the work expectations. One of the things we ran into with the Department of Justice work with the Community Oversight Advisory Board is that the work was far more than we had initially said, and even then we'd said it was going to be 10 hours a month. So I think it's important to let community members who are applying know this board or commission meets at 8 o'clock downtown on a Wednesday morning. And if, of course, we then have to discuss with our committees, is that a reasonable time to expect a broad variety of people to be able to come? And if not, why is it set like that? But definitely that should be stated. I'm troubled with the uniform application, even with the boards and commissions that I have been involved with in my bureau assignments over time. There's vastly different things that are necessary. The Citizen Review Committee is really different from the Parks Board, or even within the Parks Board. What we're asking for from the Parks Board is very different from what we ask from a citizen assigned to the Explore Washington Park Transportation Management Agreement. So we do have the one-stop application within the Office of Neighbourhood Involvement. I think that most of the boards and commissions and advisory committees that I have appointed to don't necessarily find it fits.
This may be a question more of language than disagreement. My sense, and Judy, correct me if I'm wrong, is that that the legal team views uniformity more in terms of setting the floor, but recognizing that things can be customized and adjusted. But it's the baseline expectation. So it's the minimum standards that apply to everyone, but that would not preclude customizing a set of rules that apply to a unique body. And for me, it's especially important that we set the floor, and so that we all operate on a common set of understandings. But it should not, Judy, preclude there to be, with council help, right, some tweaking.
That's absolutely correct. I think one thing when folks come to me and say that they're about to create a board, I suggest right on the application form to say, if you are selected for this seat, you will be subject to X, Y, and Z laws under state and Portland law. Because right there, you're setting up the expectation. And just to address something that Commissioner Fritz was speaking to, public versus private, I don't think there's a suggestion out there that we should encourage coffee shop conversations, but I think it's really in an advisory role to a staff member, and I know this of a transportation a PBOT committee. They have a large board, and there are sort of 10 people who always come. And the staff member is there for those 10 people, but that 10 does not constitute a quorum. So those 10 folks are frustrated by their attendance. They're coming in and they're told that we can't vote on anything because we don't have a quorum present. Well, they have ideas to share, and they could share those ideas with the staff person. So I'm definitely not suggesting the coffee shop conversations, but when we have a group or a gathering of people who are willing to share input, and we're sort of saying, nope, sorry, we can't hear from you today because we don't have a quorum, it's really frustrating to those who do attend.
I don't think we do that all that often, though. We generally you can't approve the minutes or whatever, but you can certainly have the discussion. I mean, again, the COAB went on functioning with 6 people long after they didn't have a quorum or no likelihood of a quorum.
Certainly, but I mean, in setting up the expectation that there needs to be 12 or 14 people present, the folks who do attend, and they are told that, this is going to be a suggestion. What I've suggested to folks is to do what Commissioner Fish, we just sort of vibed on that, is that just take down the comments.
Yeah.
Take down what they have to say and use that, because they are advising the staff person who is then churning the policy, giving it to the bureau director, and bringing it to council. So all the ideas are important, but because it's structured as a formal board and commission where a quorum is necessary for those recommendations to come forward, there's a little bit of confusion as to whether what is said at the meetings actually gets to the recommendation stage, because we're telling them on the one hand a quorum is required to make recommendations, but on the other hand, if there's no quorum, we'll still take what you have to say, but it's just sort of unclear.
I don't necessarily think that if there's a unanimous of 10 and the quorum was 11, I'm going to certainly take that into account. And I would still want those 10 to be meeting in a public meeting.
Absolutely.
Again, with the COAB at the end, 6 people diligently showed up, not close to a quorum, but you, Christina Nevis on my staff and others gave me the input of what they had discussed, and I was able to consider that, again, working with you to figure out what next. So anyway, if I might just continue going through, that is, the value principle of meetings being public, unless there's a really good reason not for them to be public, I think is one that I'd like to see in the resolution moving forward. I am concerned about the selection process. I would not want all of the applications to have to go through some bureau person that's not in one of my bureaus. I think that would add more complexity and time to something that is working quite well in the bureaus that I have. And I would really like to know, though, what are, as Commissioner Fish said, what is the baseline, the floor for equity considerations? What we've done in parks is, for both of the major commissions, we have the Parks Board and the Urban Forestry Commission, we have a matrix so that we look at what are the demographics of each of the people serving, both in their professional backgrounds, their age, the part of the city they represent, their ethnicity, their cultural background. And so we then look at, we seem to be missing somebody who's going to be able to represent this particular area from these particular demographics, and I'd really like to see that.
Well, and that's music to my ears, Commissioner, because one of the things we're going to work into the resolution is requesting the various bureaus to share their best practices. So the idea is not for us to reinvent the wheel. If a bureau has a process for getting broad representation on boards and commissions, taking into account things like geography, ethnic and racial diversity and things like that. And if it's successful, one of the things we want to learn during the period between the resolution and the ordinance is where is that working at a high level, and what existing models can we just make citywide?
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear that, because as you know, I've been asking you intermittently at our monthly meetings, what's happening with boards and commissions, and I'm glad this is now on the table so that I can have some input. I'm questioning under number 5, it says limit subcommittees and cap members' participation in them. What's the rationale for that?
Well, this is a concept, but let's take, this is about subcommittees, not.
Right, this is about subcommittees. I mean, I can speak to that if you'd like, Commissioner.
Yeah, I was thinking about having a rule that says no one person can serve on 150 boards and commissions, but this is different. What's the rationale for this?
Well, I think that there's a couple, but one that I think that in practice cause a lot of issues is you have so many subcommittees and a small body. Staffing them is the first issue. Then, if you also have too many people on a subcommittee, what you've created is possibly a full quorum of the whole committee. So when you're delegating, and this is a little bit deeper, but if a public body is delegating authority to a subcommittee, that subcommittee must also comply with all the public meetings, public records rules, and they too must work with a quorum, et cetera. So it's just various layers. And I know with COAB we had that issue. It's who can serve, how many subcommittees can you serve on? And in the, and sort of in the name of protecting our volunteers and saying, we only require of you 10 hours a month. If it's 4 hours of meeting and then 3 hours elsewhere, and then we've got these subcommittees on top of it, it's just to think about. And again, these are points to think about as we draft the resolution and move forward. Are we asking too much? And I know with my experience with the CRC, oftentimes they have trouble having quorums at their subcommittees. So again, what happens to the recommendations? If we can't get a quorum, can we vote on them to send up to the full committee, or is it just floating of ideas? And I think what I've experienced personally is there's a frustration from the volunteers because they feel as though either they're not following the rules or their contribution isn't being honored on either hand. So if your contribution is honored, then all the suggestions you put forth get to the ear of the decision maker. Does it need to be a 5-4 vote? Does it need to be, it's really substance over technicality is sort of the purpose of that. And again, it's something to be discussed in the next month or month and a half before we draft the resolution. I did want to address something, Commissioner, that both Commissioner Fritz and the Mayor spoke about, which is the selection process. The city has adopted public involvement principles. That happened in 2010. And as I was, striving not to reinvent the wheel, There's a ton of pre-existing principles, ideas, templates, checklists that bureaus are already using. When we talk about uniformity, we're not talking about robotic uniformity. What we're talking about is sharing the ideas that already exist. I look here, that this was from the ONI website, public involvement principles. There is a whole section on inclusivity and equity. And folks have worked very hard to come up with these things, but no one's necessarily using them. Each bureau is for themselves creating what they think they need. Again, we want to create kind of a floor, and we want to give resources to the bureaus so that they don't have to think through every time a board or commission where they need a focus group or a task force or a PI, as my colleague has termed it, public information exchange. What again, going back to the beginning, what do we really need from this group of people? Is it ideas, or is it a number, or a yes or no? And there are different kinds of boards and commissions. There's some boards that do appeals. The Tree Commission has an appeals board, and they make a decision as to whether someone gets to plant or not plant a tree. So maybe that does need to be more formal and robust and by majority. But if we're thinking about just getting ideas forward to the decision makers, maybe less formality might be a better way to get to folks. I mean, I'm on a lot of boards as well. Most of them, if they're during the day, I do it on my lunch break. Sometimes they're at 4:30 and I still can't make it. So I'll take the call and stay later. So it really depends. We have to be thinking about working people, professionals, parents. How can they participate? Maybe sitting in this format is not the best way. So if we have to follow, we have to, public meetings and public records laws per the Yellow Book, if a board or commission meets certain requirements, maybe we shouldn't make them meet those requirements so that they can be more informal. And that's sort of the tension, and that's what we're, I think, here to discuss is what is it that we're trying to get from the board? Is it really a line-by-line edit of a law, or is it what are the ideas you have that you want the decision makers to think about when they rewrite the law?
And I'm glad you mentioned the public involvement principles that we adopted. I'm wondering, has this outline been discussed at the Public Involvement Advisory Committee?
Yeah, I have reached out to the folks at ONI and the PIAC folks. And again, being in the position I'm in, we were just sharing information. My understanding is what PIAC does predominantly is not sort of this administrative administrating boards and commissions, but more reaching out to the community and doing community involvement to encourage people to join boards and commissions, or to encourage people and let them know that these opportunities are available for them to apply to.
I think that's not necessarily completely my understanding of what they do, so I think that we certainly need to involve them before Labor Day.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I'd just like to clarify my question about Robert's Rules of Order. It's not that I don't think that all of our city bodies need some kind of structure or procedural guidelines in place. It's that the formality of Robert's Rules of Order can be a barrier to participation for some people, and just simply not necessary level of formality for some of these groups. So I mean, it's not a major sticking point. I feel like I could go either way if we were actually providing training for people so they don't feel lost or intimidated in participating in that process. But I think it's worth looking at.
Commissioner, the reason why I think this is a good topic for us to look at is because it forces us, again, to ask questions at the front end. For example, one of the questions that we often ask in our work is, we're about to have a big community meeting, we're about to solicit feedback, do we want facilitators? And in certain kinds of meetings now, where we understand the complexity of weaving together lots of points of view on a hot issue, generally, most of us think that having Resolutions Northwest there is a plus in terms of how we shape the meeting and make sure all voices are respected. Well, that's become ingrained in our thinking at the front end. I think what you're suggesting is it's sort of part of the checklist up front. How formal is this body? What are the expectations? What are the rules that apply? And if it's the least formal gathering that imaginable, if it's literally just inviting a group of people to come together and share ideas,
Like an advisory committee.
like an advisory committee with as little structure as possible, you've suggested that there be the option to use a different kind of set of rules governing those meetings. And I think first figuring out what the law allows us to do and then considering those range of options is important. Whether they apply neatly to the different categories is a harder question, but I think it's a good question for us to ask.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we backdoor ourselves into official boards and commissions sometimes, not intending to make it so formal, but by giving it all the bells and whistles, walking, talking, and looking like a board and commission, we're then obliged to follow the rules. So again, that upfront analysis of why do we need this gathering would help.
So I'll stick my neck way out on this one. So I think Robert's Rules is good if you're taking a formal action. Otherwise, I'd err on the side of informality. You don't want to scare people away. And I would point out that even the city council, we function under Robert's Rules, but we actually don't. And this work session is a perfect example of where we've decided by acclaim to informalize our process when we think it's more helpful to the process that we're currently conducting. But when it gets the time to bring this resolution back, we'll be under Robert's Rules for the decision-making process itself. So I think there's a little bit of room there for flexibility.
Excellent.
No, I would agree with that. I do think one of the things I'd like to add to the member training is bias and equity training. And there is sometimes a tendency of white males to speak up in an informal session and that other people aren't as confident about entering the fray. So in that particular
Unless
case,
you're you or I, right?
I've learned over time. The question I asked at the beginning as far as who's going to be doing the application thing, and then particularly under this member training and with the requirement to be completed within 30 days of appointment. When we did do our review of boards and commissions in 2010, I think there were over 400 people serving on the 100 or so boards and commissions. So who's going to do all this training within 30 days? It seems like that would be a full-time job for a city attorney.
Well, we have a training that we've been doing, but it's at the request of bureau directors. I know Tracy Reeve, the city attorney, has gone to various bureau director meetings as we get questions and saying, hey, we have something that might answer all your questions. It's a 50-page, give us an hour at your next board or commission, and we'll tell you all about it. So it's about really formalizing that and making it a requirement because, I mean, my opinion is I don't know that it's a good idea to have folks out there who do not know that they are public officials, who are inviting each other to political events using the email chain of a board and commission and inadvertently violating the law. I think it's our obligation as the city to give them this information up front, sir.
Well, and this is where I would welcome the feedback of all my colleagues as to answer the couple of questions that Commissioner Fritz has posed. We have, as a group in the past, declared that some things are so important that we were going to formalize them. So in the face of concerns about a lack of consistency in Title VII and sexual harassment, we now have mandatory training annually under 2.02. That was a painful set of events that led us to that decision, but that became council policy, and now it's no longer discretionary. Everybody must certify 2.02 training every year, and we get a refresher. For example, some other things that we do are less formal, where you can ask, for example, around election time, we ask the city attorney, we ask Lindley to come down to our office every election cycle and make sure everyone knows do's and don'ts. And that's important because sometimes people call the office and they'll say, where do I make a contribution to so-and-so? And they have to be told, sorry, you can't call here, we can't have that conversation, we're not allowed as public employees to be engaged in that. There is, for this to work though, and I think Commissioner Fritz is raising an important question, for this to work, there has to be a decision about where it is housed because it's going to need a champion, and there is a budget. There will be a budget ask attached to it. In the same way that when we decided that we didn't have uniform systems for dealing with public records requests, we created a czar, in effect, in the city attorney's office, whose job it was to advise us. So where it resides and what level of resources do we need for this to function at a high level are questions that we would like to hear from you on, and will be part of the ordinance, which we come back Labor Day, if there's a consensus around that.
Well, that's one thing that specifically I'd like PIAC to weigh in on. I think that's really important.
Okay.
And I'll just to add to that, I'll tell you right now that the person who staffs the Public Involvement Advisory Committee is already way overworked, so we can't just add that on top of that. And secondly, I would encourage consideration, certainly all the commissions that I've set up, the new revised Human Rights Commission and the new Portlanders Policy Commission, were done very intentionally over a year or so, and it was a lot of, and you know, the pub that Commissioner Fish set up, that was a long process to decide that we wanted to elevate that. So that's at one end of the spectrum. On the other end is probably a dozen or more boards within the Bureau of Development Services. Like there's 3 people on the Plumbing Appeals Board, and there's 3 people on a bunch of other construction boards that require some technical expertise and really do not rise to the level of being similar to the Planning and Sustainability Commission.
And then I want to do it.
Commissioner and Mayor, the first step, I think, in something, Commissioner Fish and I have gone to bureau directors to say this, is probably a request for some kind of inventory, so that we can wrap our arms around what it is that's out there. And I hope that in the end we'll have 3 or 4, maybe 5 buckets of different kinds of gatherings, is what I call them now, whether they're a formal board or commission or one of these 3-person appeals boards. So I think the inventory will help us shape what kind of training is needed, et cetera, once we sort of know what's out there. And as I said, the city attorney did a very informal ask, and we found about 150 floating out there, but only about 40 or so are charter and code, and the rest are either somewhere in a resolution or created by a bureau.
And Commissioner Daly, you'll be happy to know that I asked Development Services to pull together a list, so they've got theirs, unless they've invented some more since I was in charge.
I'll just put it out there that I'm certainly open to this being administrated through ONI. It's a logical fit, but of course it would have to come with some resources because we don't have the staffing and funding capacity to take on a big project like this.
I would just like to put in a final word here and thank Commissioners Daly and Fish. I think this is excellent work, and thank you as well. I know you've been putting a tremendous amount of time into this. I'm really excited about this, and I particularly, I like the focus on clarifying expectations. I like the focus on training. I like the focus on helping people who volunteer to understand the scope and the nature of the work they're doing and what information they're being asked to provide, and also better understanding their role potentially in a sense of public meeting law. And we didn't really talk about it much, but I think it goes without saying the survey at the end is critically important. It's disappointing for me to hear that we're actually not doing exit interviews or any sort of an exit survey. That is a huge missed opportunity. So I'm really glad that you and Commissioners Fish and Daly are proposing to strengthen that. So I want to thank my colleagues for this. I think this is great work, and I look forward to seeing the final ordinance as it's shaped towards the fall. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. So we're right on time. So let me just wrap up in the 2 or 3 minutes we have left. First of all, Mayor, you mentioned people going to meetings and doing knitting. I just want to observe that we are one of the knitting capitals of the country. And I learned that recently when I went to Northwest Wool in Multnomah Village. And it turns out they have a knitting pub crawl every year, which is one of the 2 biggest crawls in America, and which brings over 10,000 people come to Portland to be part of the knitting crawl. And for those of you that want to knit Timbers uniforms or Timbers scarves, they have a whole section of just Timbers flavored wools and dyes.
Yeah,
So,
as
who
soon as
knew?
I said that, I knew I was going to get
Who
an
knew?
invitation.
Who knew? But a little shout out to Northwest Wool and the Knitting Bar Crawl.
And the two are not mutually exclusive either. I've seen people knitting in council chambers, and
There you go.
good use of time.
I want to tip my hat to one of our colleagues who's not here this morning, and that's Dan Saltzman, because part of the approach to this issue we borrowed from Dan, and that is, I've noticed that Dan often looks at big, complicated issues, puts it out there, has a discussion, and then does a resolution that lays out a roadmap for gathering further information, followed by an ordinance. And I actually wish, Mayor, we did that more often, because I think sometimes we try to jam what could be in a resolution followed by an ordinance. We try to jam those into one document. And I like the idea of a resolution saying, here's our intention, here's where we want the council and all the bureaus to participate, followed by an ordinance, because actually I think you get a better work product at the end. So our next step is to continue these conversations, respond to the excellent comments we've received today, and come to council, I think, April 3rd, with a resolution that says, May 3rd, that says, here's what we're asking everyone to do. Bureaus, we're asking you to compile a list of all your boards and commissions. We're going to ask you to pull together copies of all bylaws you're using. In keeping with an excellent suggestion from Commissioner Fritz, if you have an existing system for selecting people that's working, share your matrix with us. Give us your documentation so we can build on best practices. So that's going to be the next step. We will then take all that information and continue the conversations at council to see if we can get to consensus. And at that point, we would plan to come back with an ordinance in September. So this is the beginning, not the end of an extensive conversation. And the feedback today has been invaluable. Commissioner?
Thank you. While bureaus are collecting the data, I would really like you to ask them about the demographics of the people who are serving, so that I think we need to look at that to figure out, is that part of the problem that we need to fix? And if so, is the solution that we're going to get to going to fix it?
We will do that. A couple of just closing observations, Mayor. The first is we are likely to launch a number of boards and commissions before this work is completed on Labor Day. And so what I would like to suggest is that we come up with an informal interim process where we just get in the habit of flagging this issue, like we're going to be doing, I think, coming up soon, maybe tomorrow. We're going to be appointing the oversight body for the bond oversight. I think that's a good place to start in terms of maybe mandating some training of board members, asking Judy to sit down with each of the people we're appointing and doing sort of some baseline stuff so that they have the best chance of being successful. But we're going to have to sort of, I encourage us to think through some interim rules. Not prejudging any of this, but setting some basic expectations for any new boards and commissions between now and Labor Day. It's also my view that to formalize this, Judy, we're going to want to think about the submission sheet that we file with the clerk when we have things come to council. And we're going to want to think about whether there's a box or two that you check announcing there's a new board and commission, it's been reviewed by council, and that it conforms to our existing policies. That's one way in which we check to make sure everyone is playing by the same rules. And then I just want to acknowledge that Judy handed out a 2-page document and 8 principles guiding our work. Under each one, there's between 3 and 5 or 10 points. So there's really like 60 different things that she's highlighted. And the goal today was to just, at a very high level, put these in the public domain. And we haven't gone through each one, but there are some issues here that are going to be controversial, like term limits. That's going to be controversial, like providing a no cause for removal in the bylaws, and giving each commissioner in charge the authority to remove someone without cause. That's going to generate a healthy discussion. So there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of meat in here. And I just want to be clear, we won't be deciding this on May 3rd. We're launching this process, seeking community feedback. May 3rd, we'll formalize what it is we're asking the bureaus to do over the next 60 to 90 days. But we will not be really deciding anything formally until Labor Day. So there'll be plenty of opportunity for us to continue to get feedback. Thanks to the folks from the community that have been so engaged on this, that are here with us today. Thank you to my colleagues, and a special thank you to Judy Prosper, who's been doing this on an ad hoc basis in addition to everything else she does, but as usual, bringing real distinction to her work. So we thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor.
Very good. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Judy. Great. Next up, we have the discussion around unreinforced masonry. And Director Merlo, are you kicking us off on this?
I am, and I've got a lot of slides to show you, so I'd like to draw your attention to the rear of the room, the front of the room, I guess.
Oh, very good. Thank you. Good, thank you. Good morning. You bet. Go ahead and start.
Thank you. Good morning, Mayor, Commissioners. Carmen Merlo, the Director of the Portland Bureau of Emergency Management. It's been about almost 2.5 years since we started working on the unreinforced masonry retrofit project, and so I thought it was time, particularly since we've got a new mayor, a new commissioner, to give you an update on where we are in the status, and give you an opportunity to ask any questions. We do have one final meeting scheduled for April 19th. It'll be the culmination of the policy committee work, and certainly now would be an opportunity for us to hear some of your questions and concerns before we wrap up the work of the policy committee. So I'm going to share this presentation with Amit Kumar from the Bureau of Development Services and Shelley Hack from the Portland Development Commission. I think we know about the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. This is one of the most widely researched earthquakes in the world. Recent studies by Chris Goldfinger at Oregon State University estimates that the chances of a magnitude 9, or basically a full rupture, of the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake in the next 50 years is 22%. And a smaller rupture along the southern portion would equal a magnitude earthquake, and there's a 37% chance of that happening in the next 50 years. But that isn't the only seismic risk that we have here in Portland. We also have earthquake risk from local crustal faults, including the Portland Hills Fault, which runs directly through the city's center. What I have here are some shake maps from the U.S. Geological Survey estimating the amount of ground shaking from both a Cascadia subduction zone as well as Portland Hills Fault. And you can see that although the expected ground shaking from a Cascadia subduction zone is not as intense as a local fault, the long duration would equal severe damage to buildings. So a more intense but shorter duration shaking from a local fault, and a longer duration, more moderate shaking from a Cascadia subduction zone. So why do we care about unreinforced masonry buildings? Well, primarily because these buildings were never intended to withstand seismic shaking. They lack the structural connections that enable them to withstand even moderate earthquakes. In Christchurch, 42 people died as a direct result of unreinforced masonry buildings failing in some way. And what's of particular note is that in 71% of those cases, it wasn't the building occupants that died, it was people outside the building, either exiting from or outside the building, which tells you this is a real community problem. But life safety is not the only reason we care about unreinforced masonry buildings. In addition to the immediate life safety risk these buildings pose, they also do damage to building contents. They inevitably do damage to neighboring buildings. They generate a lot of debris and cause the blockage of transportation routes. And obviously, in many occasions, the buildings end up being demolished and end up displacing many residents and businesses. So I want to show you some before and after photos of unreinforced masonry buildings after earthquakes. This is the iconic Christchurch Cathedral. This is the heart and center of the city of Christchurch. The top of that spire for decades dictated the height of all other buildings in Christchurch. You could not build taller than that spire. So here's before and after. This is the Odeon Theater, a heritage theater in the city center. This is the Mackenzie and Willis building. This is an interior design furniture store. You can see this red building here actually caught fire after the earthquake. But because they wanted to preserve the beautiful facade, they ended up putting the scaffolding to protect against any additional damage from subsequent aftershocks. This is the Arts Center of Christchurch. This is a 28 building compound. It's the Arts and Culture Center of Christchurch. It's made up of stone masonry. You can see the extensive damage here. They ended up taking this turret down before the 6.3 earthquake in February. Otherwise, it surely would have fallen into the roof and caused more extensive damage. This is at the other end of the Arts Center of Christchurch, and I often use this photo to remind people why you do not run out of a building when the earth is shaking, because you're more likely to get damaged by objects falling on you outside than if you just stayed put. This is Colombo Street, a major thoroughfare in Christchurch. It's literally storefront after storefront of these unreinforced masonry buildings, and you can see here that it would be impossible to move an ambulance, a fire truck, or a bus down the street until you've cleared up the debris. This is from the Nisqually earthquake near Seattle in 2001. This is from the 2014 Napa earthquake. This one took place in the middle of the night, so nobody was out, thankfully. But again, notice that people inside the building would have been fine. It's the people outside that would have sustained significant harm. And Oklahoma has now the distinction of being the most seismically active state in the country. This is a historic bank, and you can see some of the bricks fell off the facade. It's not just seismic damage that makes these buildings vulnerable or seismic shaking. This is the Zanabi Apartments in Northwest Irving Street. Wind. We had a significant windstorm that took place in December of 2014, and the entire parapet fell down to the ground, thankfully injuring no one, but did cause some damage to neighboring cars and the sidewalk. Well, I want to show you what it looks like when you lose 70% of the buildings in the Central Business District and 90% of your unreinforced masonry buildings. So I'm going to give you a quick orientation to what you're looking at. These are what's known as the Grand Avenues. They make up the perimeter of the Central Business District in Christchurch. Right here is the Christchurch Cathedral, the heart and center of the city. This is the Avon River, which flows through, much like our Willamette River. So this is before, and this is what it looks like when you lose 70% of the buildings in the downtown core. In addition to the life safety risks, we are also concerned about the long-term social and economic recovery from earthquakes. In Christchurch, over 6,000 businesses were in the downtown Central Business District. They were either temporarily or in many cases permanently displaced. 10,000 homes were also lost, primarily due to liquefaction. And the earthquake itself was about 10% of their GDP. By contrast, the Tohoku earthquake in Japan was only 3% of the Japanese GDP. Many cities across the country have adopted mandatory retrofit laws already, and probably no surprise, many of your big cities in California. And the retrofits themselves extend anywhere from your basic minimum parapet bracing, tying the wall to the floor and the roof, and then more extensive building bracing and diaphragm strengthening. And sure enough, in Christchurch, of the buildings that were retrofitted, they still sustained some damage, but they did not collapse. And for those buildings that were retrofitted to almost new building standards, those buildings actually performed quite well. These two up here are electrical substations. Here's a historic church, and this is their Arts and Culture Center. So In 2014, Council directed the Bureau of Emergency Management, the Bureau of Development Services, and the Portland Development Commission to pursue policy recommendations to mitigate the risk posed by these buildings. And our first step was to update an almost 30-year-old database. At that time, we asked PSU engineering students to do an inventory for us of our unreinforced masonry buildings. So with your leadership, we hired an engineer at the Bureau of Development Services, and they spent over a year updating this 30-year-old database. And come to find out that the actual database itself was quite accurate. But in the 30 years since we did the inventory, only less than 250, buildings, or my math isn't right. Yeah, about 250 buildings have been either partially or fully upgraded, and 154 buildings have been demolished. So essentially, less than 15% of the unreinforced masonry building stock have had any upgrade. We started with 1,866. Through the validation process, we now know that we've got 1,884 URM buildings, of which about 4% are city-owned or financed. And of that stock, about a quarter are historic buildings. Just to give you some characteristics about these buildings, where they located, well, primarily concentrated in downtown Old Town Chinatown, but you can see here they also follow all of our major transportation routes. So they're all along MLK, Foster, Burnside, Sandy, Powell. And if you think about how the city was developed, it makes sense that these were all along the old streetcar lines. But what this tells me as an emergency planner is that we're going to have a lot of debris to clear from the streets before we can get fire trucks and ambulances back on the road after the earthquake. A little under 80% are smaller URMs. They make up 1 or 2 story, make up 80%, and overwhelmingly used for commercial purposes. And by square footage, I would say about 63% are under 25,000 square feet, and just 13% are over 100,000 square feet. I'm going to turn it over to Ahmet to talk a little bit about the Retrofit Standards Committee.
Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. My name is Amit Kumar. I'm a senior structural engineer with the Bureau of Development Services, and I help facilitate the meetings of the Retrofit Standard Committee, which comprised of engineers, architects, historic preservation, and geologists. The main charter of the Retrofit Standard Committee was to determine whether URM buildings should be mandated retrofit on these, and then if a mandatory upgrade is required, what standards they need to be upgraded to, and then come up with a reasonable time frame within which these buildings need to be upgraded in. So the Retrofit Standard Committee basically determined that mandatory upgrades of URM buildings is warranted, and they came up with a 5-tier classification system based on the risks posed by the buildings and its occupants to the public, the occupancy type of the buildings, and then the occupant load, and the function of the buildings before and after an earthquake. So what they came up with is this table, which has got 5 different categories, and at the very top is what we call as URM Class 1. These are the most critical buildings that need to be functional after an earthquake. These are buildings such as fire station, hospitals, water facilities that need to be functioning. Below that is the school buildings and very high occupancy buildings like churches in there, followed by buildings that are 4 stories or greater or have more than 300 occupants in the building. And Class 5 is the buildings who have the least consequence in an event of failure, and these are small 1 or 2 story buildings that have occupant loads of 0 and 10. And in between is Class 4, which is basically all the rest of the buildings, which tend to be generally 2-3 story buildings, commercial multifamily buildings. So each of these buildings were assigned an upgrade level based on the importance of these. So obviously the buildings at the very top, which is the URM class 1, which they need to be operational after an earthquake. So their upgrade standard is basically what we call as operational seismic upgrade. At the bottom is the ones that have the least consequences. Then they have the lowest standard for upgrade, which is essentially all you're doing is bracing the parapets and tying the walls to the floors. A vast majority of the buildings fall in class category 3 and 4. And for those, we have what we call as a life safety performance level. And for class 4 buildings, it's something a little bit less than the life safety, which is called as a modified Bolts Plus. And I'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute here. Life safety performance standard is basically saying that in an event of a magnitude 9 earthquake, the building after an earthquake may or may not be repairable, but people can exit safely from the building. It has some resistance to earth aftershocks in an event of an aftershock that happens there. So these were the standards that were assigned to these different buildings. And during the public process, what we heard and what the policy committee recommended, that the buildings in class 3 be combined with buildings in class 4, and then the upgrade standard be reduced from a life safety level to what we call as a modified Bolts Plus. And this is where we have most of the buildings. We have about 1,300 of the buildings in this category, which is now we call as class 3 buildings. What this modified Bolts Plus standard is, basically what we're saying is if a building qualifies, and there are 5 qualifiers to this building, and those 5 qualifiers basically they came up with is, the building would perform reasonably well. We don't have to do a full life safety upgrade, but they have characteristics in there, like they have solid walls, their mortar strength is good. So if they qualify in that, or if the building can be brought up to meet those qualifiers, then all you have to do is brace the parapets, brace the parapets, attach the walls to the floors and the roofs, attach it to the diaphragm for in-plane shear, and then if they are very slender walls, then you need to brace the walls so that the walls don't fail. So this is a lower standard than a life safety upgrade, and this is where I think most of the buildings fall in the city of Portland. So this is what we call as a modified Bolts Plus standard.
So could you be clear? This you said this is a lower standard than life safety.
Right.
So what are you left with?
So what if for buildings that need a life safety upgrade, they might have to be you have to do some things like diaphragms that need to be upgraded.
But this isn't that standard.
Right.
So operationally, the building will not be inhabitable, but you're also saying it doesn't meet life safety standards.
Well, the buildings that would qualify under this are we believe will perform pretty well. They have what we call as a robust buildings. They have solid walls in there. They have mortar strengths that are big. So based on past experience and some analysis that engineers have done, we think they will perform much better. So you don't need to do other unnecessary upgrades on those.
So with this modified Bolts Plus standard, you think that will do a reasonable job of protecting safety both inside the building as well as immediately adjacent to the building, but it doesn't speak at all to whether the building is a total loss or not.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And the other thing is, generally we're talking about here in case of a magnitude 9 earthquake, so these big earthquakes there. But if we do get a smaller earthquake, we expect when the buildings are more upgraded to these standards that they would be repairable, and we could go back, and businesses and people can go back into their buildings. So once these standards were assigned to each of these different categories.
I'm sorry to interrupt, just one more clarification for my notes. So, and that standard is being defined by a 9.0 seismic event. What are you, when the Bolts Plus, what threshold are you assuming here?
So there are the codes define what earthquakes you need to design buildings for. So based on that earthquake level, it's basically in terms of probabilistic analysis, it's like 20% in 50 years probability. So then based on that, you come up with what the ground shaking is. And using those numbers, we come up with what these anchorages are supposed to be designed for.
So,
Can I answer that a different way, Mayor? So,
yeah, no, I'm bringing back regression analysis and probability theory, and I'm trying to simplify this.
I'm going to dumb it down.
My tiny
If I get it
brain.
wrong, Amit, tell me.
Thank you.
Basically, you're designing to the expected amount of ground shaking at that location. Now, a magnitude 9 is the amount of energy released, but that's not the expected ground shaking here in Portland because of the distance and the soil.
Right, that gets you to the
Right.
heat map that you showed us earlier.
Exactly.
Okay.
So we have to design to all the expected earthquakes at that location.
Okay. Thank you, that's helpful.
So the timelines. So once we assigned the different upgrade categories to the different URM classes, the committee then decided on what the timeline should be assigned to it. The committee was trying to balance the need for immediate seismic improvements against the desires of building owners who wanted a larger, longer time frame to spread the costs over and also to plan for any kind of disruptions. So what they came up with is establish some intermediate benchmarks where we could gain some significant life safety benefits while the entire seismic upgrade could be spread out over a longer time frame. So what they came up with is these different, basically a four-step process. The first step is basically to do an evaluation of the building to identify what the deficiencies in the building are, and that's done through what we call as an ASC 41 assessment, and then there was a requirement for a geotechnical report, and the committee asked that be done within a 3-year time frame. The next step was basically to brace the parapets and to attach the walls to the floors, and you had 10 years to do that portion of the work. And what that does is provide some benefits so that you don't have parapets falling into the right-of-way, hurting people on the sidewalks and also from collapsing of the buildings. The next step is step 3, which is a little bit more intrusive. You would probably have to go inside the buildings to do the work. It's attaching the floors to the walls and also the diaphragms in there. And that was assigned for a 20-year time frame to complete that work. And the full seismic upgrade for most of the buildings, which were class 3 and 4, was again over a 25-year time frame. With a 5-year additional extension for any economic hardship that the owners could demonstrate. Again, through the public hearing process, there were some modifications made to that table. We got rid of the requirement for a geotechnical report because the geotechnical report was basically being done to inform the building owners of what their potential problems are if their building is located on liquefaction site, but there was no action required if the owner decided not to do it. It was more for informational purposes. So we removed the requirement for it. We've just made a recommendation that they be done so the owner is informed. Then also there was some concern about the amount of time that is required to do an assessment for buildings. Then we have 1,600 or 1,800 buildings to be done in a 3-year time frame. So we extended the time frame for URM class 3 buildings to 5 years, and then no assessment is required for class 4 buildings. The time frame that you see here is, if you compare that to the time frames that other jurisdictions in the country have done, they typically have required seismic upgrades within about a 7 to 13-year time frame. So this is a pretty extended time frame that has been provided so that the owners can plan for it. They can, figure out what the financing they need, and then also to plan for any disruptions. I guess the big elephant in this room was what do these seismic upgrades cost? The Retrofit Standard Committee basically based these costs on what we call as a FEMA 156, where it was based on data that was collected throughout the country, and then we projected that out to what the costs are for the city of Portland in current dollars. The bottom line is, we have about 1,640 buildings that have not been upgraded at this point of the 1,800 buildings that we have identified. and we have about 20.6 million square feet of URM buildings, with a total cost of upgrade we estimate is about $1.4 billion. City-owned buildings, we have about 47 buildings that need seismic upgrades with a cost of about $30 million. For city-financed buildings, we have about 26 buildings with a cost of upgrade of estimation of about $42 million. So that's just the same slide from before.
What's covered with the category city finance buildings? At affordable housing
Yeah.
primarily?
Right. City-owned, city finance is mostly affordable housing. The city also commissioned cost-benefit analysis, and Ken Gattell, he's a nationally recognized expert in doing these cost-benefit analysis for these buildings. In fact, he was one of the original authors of that analysis that we had done in 1994. And what the conclusion from that benefit analysis was that there is a positive benefit, a life safety benefit against the cost. So for example, if you, for these class 3 buildings there where we have over 80%, we have over 80% of the buildings, the cost to benefit analysis is about 1.6 to 1.97, which means that for every dollar you put in, the life safety benefits would range from 1.6 to 1.9 dollars.
Good morning, I'm Shelley Hack with the Portland Development Commission.
Shelley, I need you to speak into that mic, thanks.
Shelley Hack with the Portland Development Commission. I've been working with the project team and had lead responsibility for facilitating the support committee work. The charge of that committee was to evaluate and make recommendations about the options to help private building owners overcome the barriers to complying with the proposed code. The committee was made up of a variety of stakeholders, including developers, owners, finance folks, engineers, government reps, as well as folks representing historic preservation. We met 6 times between May of 2015 and November of 2015, and the basic findings was that one, the issue is really complex. The owner's needs and the conditions of the property are different. There's diverse ownership structures as well as diverse capitalization structures, and all of those play into the ability of a building owner to finance the retrofits. There's also, as a result, one solution isn't going to solve all of the problems. Did this get? So some of the buildings, there was also discussion about what happens if folks can't finance. And so some of the buildings, there was an acknowledgement, would ultimately have to come down. As it relates to the use of public dollars, folks felt that the focus should be on life safety benefits, where there is the greatest benefit and the greatest number of buildings and at the least cost to the public. The recommendations were articulated in a support committee report that was issued in December, and it breaks down the category into 4 different areas. Financial assistance, which had the greatest interest, obviously, issues around policy, technical assistance support, as well as just general information and community outreach. How do we help the city of Portland and its residents understand the seismic risk and how to manage that? By far, the greatest interest and concern was in the financial assistance area. Some of the ideas there were creating a low-cost loan program, providing some level of credit enhancement, developing a grant or a rebate program that could help defray some of the costs, developing a property tax exemption program, a state tax credit program, as well as building upon the accelerated depreciation option that's available for energy retrofits at the federal level. So those were all some of the ideas that came out of the conversation. What the greatest challenge is, where's the resources going to come from? We have begun work on a couple of these ideas. The Property Assessed Clean Energy Program, which was approved about a year and a half ago, has since been modified to allow for a seismic retrofit. We're also in conversations and have introduced Senate Bill 311 that would provide a 15-year tax exemption for properties that undergo a seismic retrofit. Last session, there was legislation introduced for a state tax credit that would support historic preservation. Unfortunately, that legislation failed. It was not reintroduced in this session, but there is conversations about how we can bring it back to the table. We also have $5 million in tax increment funds that have been allocated out of the Old Town Chinatown URA budget to help us experiment. The parameters that have been placed around the use of those funds by our board and executive staff have been that the experimentations, we want to make sure that the experimentations have applicability outside urban renewal areas, because we recognize while there's a significant portfolio of URMs inside urban renewal areas, that's not going to be the entire solution. We've got many properties that don't fall within those boundaries. And lastly, there's also
If you bond against those proceeds, do they have to be expended in the URA? In other words, if you want to create a revolving loan fund or something like that. Yes.
Yeah, tax increment resources have to be used within the jurisdiction where they're generated. So we couldn't take the $5 million out of Old Town Chinatown and use it in Lents.
Got it.
We'd have to use the Lents resources, or if we have it out, we'd need unrestricted resources in essence. So, there's also conversation going on with PBS about creating a floor area ratio bonus that would provide some level of additional value to URM property owners that could potentially be sold to generate cash for some of the retrofit. So those are the primary ideas and the things that we are working on right now. Again, the greatest challenge is this problem. The cost far outweighs the resources that we currently have available, and that's the nut that we really need to crack.
Okay, I'll just kind of close here to let you know that we have been meeting as a policy committee for about a year and 4 months now. And throughout that time, we've convened 3 public meetings, one specifically to listen to the concerns of the tenants of the unreinforced masonry buildings. And as you heard from Ahmed, have made fairly significant changes to the recommendations based on what we've heard at these public meetings. We've also given extensive presentations to everyone from DRAC, BOMA, PPS, and others. And we are wrapping up the work right now. We have one final meeting on April 19th, as I mentioned. In addition to the recommendation of the mandatory retrofit, some other recommendations include enforcement provisions, primarily through fines and placarding and tenant notification, and determining an appeals process for those URM buildings that are determined not to be unreinforced masonry. So that's it for our presentation. I wanted to make sure we had enough room for your questions.
Carmen, let me jump in. And first of all, thank you for a very comprehensive and thoughtful presentation. I want to focus on cost, unintended consequences, and priorities. First, the cost. Are we setting up a system here which is going to create a perverse incentive for owners to demolish historic buildings?
Commissioner, I think it's safe to say that inherently this will result in more demolitions, but I do not believe that it will be it'll result in a perverse use of that provision to encourage demolition. We hope and feel that through the retrofit of these buildings, they'll be able to gain more market value and potentially to increase the occupancy and use of those buildings. So it'll have a benefit, not a cause for demolition.
I guess the area of concern here is we already have the idea of demolition through neglect that has crept into our practice. Now we're suggesting costs of retrofitting buildings, which may be prohibitive. I just want to make sure we're not working at cross purposes with what we hear from the community about preserving historic buildings. And that's a conversation that really has to be between the Bureau of Development Services, the landmark folks, and your bureau, but that's something I'd like to follow up on. Number two is I'm concerned about the impact on arts organizations and artists. My sense is that some of these buildings have historically been places where creative people can get cheap space. And, you know, there's always a kind of a fight about what triggers the upgrades currently and what's the intended use. And at a time when arts organizations are being priced out of the city and affordability is the touchstone, I want to make sure that, again, that whatever we're doing here doesn't work at cross purposes with our desire to have affordable spaces for people to train and to do everything short of performances. And that's something, again, I would want to see worked out with the Bureau of Development Services and others, just to see what that tension is, because I think inevitably with the changes proposed by the Fire Bureau and now these changes, we're gonna aggravate the affordability challenge we have for arts organizations. So I want to better understand that holistically. On page 23 of the PowerPoint, you talk about FAR bonus transfer in discussion. I lived in New York City when the city was faced with the challenge of how to maintain the historic theaters in Times Square. And you had all these historic theaters that were in bad condition, and they had there was no mechanism for funding the rehabilitation. So what the city essentially did, if I recall, was they assigned bonuses to each of these buildings, which were otherwise sort of boxed out. It essentially gave them a grant of FAR and said, you can go into the marketplace and sell that, provided all of the proceeds are used to renovate the theater. And that was the great innovation which was used to bring back all the historic theaters and then, by extension, brought back Broadway. And is that something you're looking at, or a model like that, where we would be giving people something that has market value with the condition that if they were to transfer or sell it, 100% of the proceeds would be used to address this problem?
That's exactly right, Commissioner. We're exploring that as we speak.
Okay, and then finally, in looking at these numbers, I have to say I have a different view of our $5 million pot in one urban renewal district, because it isn't even a drop in the bucket, really, given the huge numbers that you're forecasting here. Is it our intention with the $5 million fund that's generated from TIF in Old Town Chinatown, is it our intention to use that exclusively for city-funded residential buildings?
That parameter has not been, or that limit has not been that limit has not been placed on the use of those funds.
So in that spirit, because I think that's a big policy question about, do we start with buildings where low-income people are living, or do we look to commercial buildings that may be underutilized? It would be helpful for me if I got a list of all the city finance buildings that you refer to at page 21. Thank you. Of course you do, and it's even legible for me, so, because you never miss a trick. No, you blew it up. So thank you. And thank you, sir. This is legible for me. What I would respectfully suggest is that as we think about the pilot in Old Town Chinatown, and again, $5 million seems like a very, very modest pilot in light of the cost that you're forecasting, I think we should have a discussion about whether it's whether everyone is eligible to participate or whether we want to focus on city-financed, low-income housing developments, because there are some older buildings there, and I'm thinking that they may be at some of the greatest risk. I think we should make it, we should be talking about whether that comes first over a commercial building, particularly since we have such a limited pot. Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit more about the seismic CPACE where it says authorized in development? Where are we at with that?
The CPACE program is a relatively new financing structure. Are you you're familiar with it?
I'm relatively
Okay,
familiar
okay,
with
good.
it. Property assessed.
So we are just rolling out the energy retrofit component and are enrolling capital providers in that program. And so we expect that within the next month that initial rollout will be complete, and then staff will be turning their attention to figuring out the programmatic guidelines for the seismic retrofit component. Some of the things that we've developed for energy won't necessarily work on the seismic side, so we have to tease out those differences.
Great, thank you.
So I've been just looking at the cost for city-financed or city-owned buildings, because I don't think we should require private property owners to do something that we can't do ourselves for our own public buildings. And it's a sizable sum, even just to keep them from falling down. It's for the Class 1 is 1.6 million altogether. To get to the Class 1, actually we could use our community centres, as we hope that we'll be able to, for emergency shelter in various things. That is 1.6 million. If we go to the kind of in between, Class 3 is 52.5 million. So, colleagues, I think we have to look at, first of all, can we do it ourselves and for our own buildings, and if so, how? And then secondly, is it reasonable to require community members to do this absent any funding from the state?
Carmen, can I ask you to walk me through one line item on this chart just to make sure I understand it?
I hope so, yes.
Let's go to page 3.
Okay.
And the title is Affordable Housing on the
Okay.
top left. And the thing that jumps out at me on this list is that these are all pretty old buildings. So I guess I should say I'm relieved that there's none of the more recent buildings are on this list. So presumably that means the buildings in the last 20 years built to code do not present the same challenges. But let's just take an example. Can you go down to 5 from the bottom? So Rose, Fairfield, Laurelhurst, Clifford. Let's go to the Admiral Apartments, because I'm familiar with that one, because that was part of our preservation plan. So can you walk us through each of the categories just so we know how to read this?
I'm going to defer and turn it over to Javier with the Housing
Could I
Bureau.
get the?
Absolutely.
Javier, would you do this from memory first, please, and then we'll I just want to make sure I'm reading this correctly. Javier Mena is the Deputy Director of the Housing Bureau, so he's the man here.
Good morning, Commissioners. Let me just go through this. We do recognize that this is a URM building, and in terms of the number of tenants that it has and what we're looking at, the impact that it would have on the portfolio, we included it on the list as it is something that we need to strategize as to how we're going to address. Some buildings are more dire than others. I would not put the Admiral in the same category as the Medford Hotel. The Medford Hotel is in immediate need of repairs, and so what our goal is, and something that was not included in the PowerPoint, is that in regard to affordable housing projects that the city has financed, we would like to come to council with a plan as to how we're going to address that, and if we can address it in the 25 years or 30 years that has been recommended. Obviously, a lot of these projects have limited income. and they do not generate enough cash flow to be able to get financing. So that means that the city PHB will have to come in and, with our resources, leverage tax credits, leverage private financing in order to make those things happen.
Well, I guess what jumps off the page for me, Director Mena, is that, we've historically thought, sort of rule of thumb, that preserving a building for affordable housing had advantages over new construction, in part because it's already built. We don't have to demolish or deconstruct, so it's more environmentally friendly. It generally often costs out as a better deal. But frankly, I don't know that when we did some of the comparisons between preservation and new construction, we fully factored in the seismic upgrade costs. Did we, or is this relatively new?
It's relatively new. I would say in the past 4 years is where this has come to bear. In prior projects like the Rex project, which is in Martha, Washington, which are about 6 or 7 from the top, they went through some rehabs, but they did not include complete retrofits. And so that was missed. I would say that currently we not only deal with the expense of the rehab and the retrofit, but also the targeted population that a lot of these projects are servicing are difficult to house tenants that moving them anywhere else would not be as easy as it would be than retrofitting the project itself.
Yeah, it's sobering, actually, look at this, because, again, I mean, some of we made judgments about preserving existing buildings, upgrading them, keeping people in place. We made judgments about the location of the property, and we did some cost benefit. But there's this new overlay, and in some instances, this is, I think, going to change the way we look at preservation versus new construction going forward. Is that fair to say?
That's correct.
Commissioner, with your indulgence, Margaret Mahoney, who's been the chair of our policy committee, would like to make a few statements.
Good morning, commissioners. As Carmen said, I've been chairing the policy committee for the last year plus, I think. I did want to clarify where I see the policy committee at this point in time, because I'm not sure that the PowerPoint, as you got it this morning, gives you a picture of that. As Carmen said, we have one meeting scheduled, remaining on our calendar. I have a serious question about whether we're going to get to a consensus recommendation to you at that meeting. The committee is, I think, a good cross-section of representation, although I think there are some members of the public who've attended our meetings who may feel that we're not quite as representative as they'd like. But the committee has done a lot of hard work. The staff has been very good about bringing us information, but the committee is having a lot of difficulty weighing, excuse me, the balance between public safety and the immense cost of these improvements, and particularly for how those will affect different owners. There's the large group of private owners who, as Commissioner Fritz said, are going to be faced with some requirements that maybe the city even can't meet. And traditionally, money spent on seismic improvements for private landlord do not bring forth increased revenues as a result of those. So there's a different cost benefit in a lot of respects for the private owner. Second, there are a substantial number of residential buildings in that mix, many of which are affordable housing. And as Commissioner Fish noted, there's a real concern about the population there and the vulnerability. The other thing is in not just the vulnerable residents, as Javier mentioned, but the cost of relocating those residents while retrofits is done is extremely difficult, because given our market right now, there's no place to put them for 9 months to 15 months while you retrofit a building. Third, there's a group of schools and churches in this mix. Most of our downtown churches and many of our neighborhood churches are in these groups, and quite a few of the PPS schools and some private schools are in there. The only financial proposal that would benefit property owners right now that has a chance but it's still waiting for legislative action, is the property tax exemption proposal. That will not benefit churches and schools. So the big question is, where's the money going to come from to do this work, and what's going to be the impact of not having that money? My sense of the committee at this point, and there are a couple other committee members here this morning, Walt McMoney is next to me, and Tom Carollo, and Javier is a member of the committee as well. I think the committee generally feels like going forward with a mandatory program without some financial incentives is untenable. So my expectation is the committee may get to a point of saying to you, we think the public safety risk is considerable. We support the Bolts Plus approach because that's what's been used in most of California and Washington. But we think implementing specific mandatory timeframes needs to be done when there are financial resources available. So again, I'm forecasting based on my listening to everybody at this point, but we're not in unanimity at this point, and I wanted you to understand that.
I really appreciate that comment, and in light of that, I think I have two suggestions,
Yeah.
One for housing and one for Carmen. For housing, I think we should, starting today, require that any proposal that comes to council flags the issue of the potential cost of a retrofit. I mean, the Joyce Hotel was acquired, I think, just within the last year. Correct. And we cheered the fact that we were preserving an at-risk building, but I don't remember any discussion at council about the contingent obligation we may be taking on to actually bring the building to code. And that may or may not have influenced the decision to put public resources in. So I think going forward, particularly with the bond money, we're going to have to be very clear about the seismic condition of a building and at least flag what are the potential costs. And I'll use an analogy that's from Commissioner Fritz's world. By council policy, we now have a rule that says if you build a new park, and if the council approves a new park, we must budget the O&M. And that's because for years we used to build parks but not fund the operations and maintenance. Now it's required. It's policy. If you build it, you must fund it. And that just gets built into the Cal targets. I think we're going to have, though, a same level of transparency around the contingent liability, because I'm all for saving old buildings that have very vulnerable populations, but I think we have to be clear-eyed about the contingent obligations we may be taking on. And the second piece, Carmen, has been a pet peeve of mine for a while, but if it turns out we're not going to be acting right away, if there's if this question of how we finance it holds us up, I look at these buildings under affordable housing where there's a risk, and my sense is we need to seriously consider an interim measure, which is bringing them into your emergency management system. And I know they may or may not be in part of that formally or informally, but if we're forecasting some greater risk in the event of a seismic event, and we know that there's very vulnerable people there, I think we have to have a plan that you monitor as our emergent disasters are, that says, if something happens, we've got a plan for dealing with all the folks who live in these buildings, and we've got good coordination and communication. That is a minimum if we're not going to be able to move in the short term to actually make the building safer. You and I have talked about that in the past, but
Yeah.
I think I can't see any such scenario here now that we're green-lighting all this, where we don't at least take some steps to make sure that in the event of something bad happening, we've got a plan of action for each of these buildings that we've identified as being at risk.
Okay.
And Commissioner, I did ask that question with the Ellington, and I believe the costs of retrofitting that were included in the estimated repairs for it. And I also want to just remind everybody, it's not just parks that is required to have operations and maintenance money assigned to it. Any new city facility does. I know that with the Emergency Communications Centre or Emergency Operations Centre, that came with operations and maintenance. And I think what's something that Commissioner Saltzman hopefully will look into is, are new streets also then going to need city funding? So I do think I agree with your direction, which is let's look at all of these things at the same time.
I just have a couple questions.
Commissioner Fish, just to reply to you, in regard to, we do require of any proposal that it's a URM building to include a retrofit. We have been waiting on the Medford for 4 years because of that. They had requested funds for rehab, but without a retrofit understanding, we will not moving forward until we see what the total cost would be. In terms of the Joyce Hotel, so that you know, that's one of the reasons, one of the many reasons why the Joyce Hotel was acquired. We do expect to, and expected from the beginning as we were getting ready to acquire it, to do a retrofit and be a staging project for the other buildings to be retrofitted. So the populations that are in each of those buildings will be able to relocate to the Joyce Hotel for that purpose.
Does your analysis also contemplate that if at some point the costs of the retrofit make it infeasible, that,
Yes.
that you would consider demolishing the building and because it's a very desirable site and building something state-of-the-art?
Most definitely. That's what we've had conversations with all of our partners regarding that.
Great. Some of these buildings, would they have certain historic designations that would prevent them from being demolished regardless of the cost of the upgrade?
Commissioner Daly, this is not my area of expertise, but I do think that we'd have to go through his design. I'm forgetting the name of the group right now, but Landmarks Commission. Thank you.
Okay.
Before demolition, absolutely.
And then my next question is, wouldn't seismic upgrades add value to a property? I'd think you'd want to pay less for a property that hadn't had upgrades.
I mean, I think that's where we're struggling, Commissioner, is that certainly in other parts of the country that do experience earthquakes more often, there is a market for more resilient buildings. People are willing to pay more to be in a seismically resilient building, much like people are willing to pay more now for a LEED building. Unfortunately, that kind of market drive hasn't materialized here yet, but that's kind of where we're hoping it'll go.
And then, is there any increased liability for the property owner having a URM that is occupied in the event of loss of property and loss of life?
I don't know how to answer that question. I mean,
Well, if you're renting out a building that isn't up to certain standards or codes, it seems that I'm just trying to determine what the
If I
risk
may,
is.
the question that's come before the committee, and we've had the city's risk manager come and speak to us as well, is right now there is no mandatory requirement to upgrade the building. These buildings exist, for the most part, in compliance with city codes. There may be conditions we don't know about, but generally they're viewed as compliant. So the question being raised before the policy committee is if the city passes a mandatory requirement and there is no money for either public or private owners to upgrade their buildings, are they liable in that situation? And basically, we don't have an answer for that.
That is an answer. I'm just trying to get to. I'm also a little concerned with the incentive to demolish, just given that we're losing so many of our historic buildings already. I think there's a point where it just doesn't make sense to upgrade those. So, thank you. It's helpful. Any other comments from my colleagues?
Just a process question. Carmen, again, thank you for a very thorough presentation. Can you walk us through the next points along the
Sure.
the road forward and when this may come back to council?
So our next meeting is scheduled for April 19th. I'm hearing from our chair that we will likely not be able to reach consensus at that meeting. If it comes to that, we'll certainly schedule a few more meetings. We initially intended to bring recommendations to council in late summer. I don't know if that's realistic anymore.
Is it your intention on any recommendations to make sure they've been vetted by both the Housing Bureau and the Bureau of Development Services?
Yes, they've been our partners throughout the whole process. So whatever recommendations we bring forward to you, Commissioner, will certainly have the buy-in from our partner bureaus.
I believe our meeting is adjourned. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everyone.